We often hear now that women die as often from diseases of the heart without calculating the fact that, yes, men die of diseases of the heart, but at a much younger age. And all of these 14 out of 15 areas of death are being much higher with men. And yet, the important thing to understand in this context is that we have 7 federal offices of women's health and 0 federal offices of men's health. Can you imagine the sexism that we would be accurately accused of if women died 5 years earlier than men and died earlier of 14 out of 15 of the leading causes of death, and we had 7 offices of men's health and 0 offices of women's health? It's not conceivable that that would be the case.
Right.
Yet that is the case. And more potently, no one is protesting it, and very few people even know about it.
That was Warren Farrell, who recently sat down with Ken Wilber for a 3-hour discussion of his new book, The Boy Crisis, co-written with John Gray. In this discussion, Warren and Ken take an in-depth look at the many social, cultural, and psychological challenges that young boys and men are facing today, while noting how many of these challenges are the products of well-intentioned, but often misguided, feminist praxis. Not that feminism is inherently hostile to men. Far from it. As Warren notes in his book, many prominent feminist leaders over the decades have understood the critical role that fathers play in their children's development and psychological well-being. He quotes Gloria Steinem, who famously said, "What the world needs now is more women at work and more dads at home." He also recalls Betty Friedan's popular book, The Second Stage, which was a call for men to consciously begin the same process of self-liberation and redefinition of their roles and identities that women have struggled with over the last century, going so far as to say that the major goals of feminism can never be fully attained if men are not also engaged in an equivalent praxis on their side. As the saying goes, if you only row the boat with one oar, you're just going in circles. As the era of Me Too continues to put a spotlight upon the many pressures, indignities, and injustices that women face in the public sphere, Farrell and Gray are bringing some much-needed attention to the pressures, indignities, and injustices that men are also experiencing in the private and public spheres, and in their private lives. So check out this first segment from Ken and Warren's discussion, and consider becoming a supporting member of integrallife.com in order to hear the rest of this 3-hour conversation.
Lou? Hey, Warren.
Ken, I am looking so forward to talking to you. I'm so sorry that I was a little delayed. I've had a tooth extraction and bronchitis combined, and so I've been trying to recover in between things that I'm responsible for. But no one understands this better than you do with all that you've been through health-wise. This stuff about getting older. What was the alternative?
None. Dennis Leary used to always joke. He would say that, he's smoking. He said, so smoking takes 10 years off your life, but who cares? It's the last 10 years.
It's the last 10 years.
Right, exactly. Well, we've got another crisis on our hands, and it's the topic of your recent book called The Boy Crisis, and John Gray contributed a section to it on handling ADHD. Your book is subtitled "Why Our Boys Are Struggling and What We Can Do About It," and it could be subtitled, so the world's largest unacknowledged nightmare. And as usual, the stuff you're doing is countercultural in the best sense, meaning that you give enormous amounts of evidence and really carefully reasoned arguments for truths that basically aren't really known well in culture. This was all the way back to your book on the myth of male power and father and child reunion. Just an enormous number of topics. The boy crisis really is serious. And you say, as the chapters on the evidence make clear, boys are declining in a dramatic way in virtually every key metric. And that means educationally, economically, emotionally, in reference to drugs, crime, suicide, physical health, mental health. And all of these areas and more, boys are crashing big time. And we're going to go through this, but it really is alarming. And what's worse, very few people seem to know about this. although the evidence is fully available and overwhelming. But it's really quite serious, isn't it?
It is amazingly serious, and the sadness that you just sort of responded to about few people knowing about this, and as you know from the myth of male power, we as boys and men were always trained to be thought of as heroes as a result of being able to be willing to be disposable as warriors in war,
right,
and disposable in the workplace. And when you train somebody to be disposable, if your son has to be disposable potentially to be a hero, and your daughter has options, you're fearful to a greater degree of it psychologically attaching to your son, who you may have to, on some unconscious level, let go of in order to really think of him as being wonderful and extraordinary.
Right.
And to say, with not just in war, but also in the workplace, all the 93% of the people who die in hazardous jobs are males, and an even higher percentage of people who die in the residuals of the hazards, meaning like the black lung disease after being a coal miner or being a firefighter, or from pesticide poisoning that doesn't kill you necessarily on the job,
right,
but shortens your life afterwards when you're flying a plane over farm fields and getting the residuals of the pesticide poisoning coming into your brain. And so all of this has led us to not caring a great deal about what happens to boys, because our survival was dependent, our survival as people was dependent upon boys being disposable. And so if your survival is dependent upon somebody else being disposable, it's really hard to get into caring a great deal about their health and them protecting
right,
themselves, even
right,
though we also feel a different way, which we all want our sons to be safe. And you see this in things like football. You're out there cheering for your son to be to get a touchdown, and and going 1st and 10, let's do it again.
Right.
What exactly are you doing? You're risking spinal cord injury, concussion, dislocated shoulders again and again, and you're cheering for your son to do this. And then, of course, if your son goes to the hospital, you're really hoping he'll get better, and you care enormously about his safety. And girls send flowers, and the cheerleaders do as well. And then at the same time, you're saying, all right, now you're better, go back and do it again. So for the first time, we've begun to care about boys, because boys who hurt us. They're hurting us in two significant ways: in school shootings and mass shootings on the one hand, and also they're hurting us by being almost all of the ISIS recruits are dad deprived, are boys that don't have fathers to be able to guide them through the journey
right,
from boyhood to manhood. And so now that boys are hurting us via joining ISIS and getting involved in shootings, we're beginning to pay attention as to maybe something's happening with boys. And oh yes, they're hurting girls too. The Me Too movement is saying that they're terrible as well. And so, okay, what is happening with boys? But it's still mostly boys as the oppressors rather than boys as vulnerable.
Yeah, well, exactly. And all of these factors have come together in a really disturbing way, and you detail most of them. And so we're just going to go through and review basically what you're saying and the ideas that you're advancing. This is incredibly important stuff, and again, almost unknown in the culture at large. So as you go through the various areas in which we see these problems arising, you start with the crisis of our son's mental health. You say the rate of mass shootings has tripled since 2011. Our daughters are not killing. Our sons are. The murder-suicide combination of school and other mass shootings is largely young white boys' way of driving off the cliff at the end of mental health's torturous road. The National Academy of Sciences reports that increase in suicide among white males led to as many white males' lives lost to suicide as have been lost to AIDS. Between 15 and 19, boys commit suicide at 4 times the rate of girls. And between 20 and 24, the rate of male suicide is between 5 and 6 times that of females. By the time they're 85, you point out later, that's jumped to 16.5 times that of females. I mean, that's just horrifying. In a certain sense, it seems like there's sort of nothing more indicative of the quality of life than rate suicide. It's not looking good.
No, you're absolutely right. And when you think of boys and girls aren't inherently different in this area, in the sense that at the age of 9, boys and girls commit suicide at exactly the same rate, and it's very minimal. And it's only as the combination of testosterone that increases during boys and adolescents, combined with their role, and combined especially with their role and not knowing their role, meaning, which sounds like a contradiction, but their role is often to perform, but they don't often know how to go about doing that. And so there's this sort of slippery slope when boys don't, in the old days, boys had a very clear sense of purpose. You prepared to become that hero, either as a warrior or as a worker. And so it's wonderful that boys have more flexible senses of purpose today, and in the sense that they don't need to necessarily go to war. Many fewer boys are needed for war, and many fewer boys are needed to die in the workplace. So, and boys can get approval from fathers and families when they have more flexibility in their roles. So for the first time in human history, boys have the potential to be treated as human beings rather than as human doings, as just having to prepare themselves to do something in order to be worthwhile. That's the good news. The bad news is that there's a purpose void, that the old senses of purpose, to be that hero, to be that warrior, to be that full-time sole breadwinner, are no longer definitions of masculinity. Now that's extremely good news for boys who then have a father to help them have a role model, to help them discover who they are, and be also able to discover not only what is fulfilling for the boy, but also how do you make a living doing what is fulfilling, or how do you give up a little bit about what is fulfilling in order to make a living. And so what is that combination of responsibility for your future family combined with doing the things that are fulfilling? Because as you and I have discussed before, the more fulfilling the occupation, the less it pays on the average. And so when you encourage a boy to be a full-time writer, artist, actor, you're oftentimes pushing him down the road of not being a starving artist or so on. And so boys had this opportunity, but we have two things happening simultaneously that only integral people will really understand almost immediately. And one is a culture that is no longer giving boys a secure definition of what their purpose is, combined with a very high percentage of boys who know, about a third of all boys in the United States, who have significant periods of time as they're growing up not having the guidance of a father. And so girls today have two very different phenomena happening. They have a culture of multi-purpose girls and women. You can be full-time involved with the children. You can be full-time involved in the workplace. You can do some combination of both. And that's been what the women's movement has offered to girls and women. And they've also many girls and women are living with single moms, so they have a female role model combined with a culture of multiple expectations. The female role model, the mom, can help them discover themselves and help them focus on what part of themselves they want to pursue, the career part, the raising children part, the raising money part, or the combination part. Whereas boys are missing those two things. They're missing a culture that says you can be anything you want to be. It's more like wait and see if you're going to have children and you're going to be a father. And if your wife wants to work full time, then you have one role. If your wife wants to be full time involved with the children, you're going to have to magnify your sole breadwinner role. So you don't have a culture telling you be whoever you want to be. And you don't have a father in a third of the cases in the United States telling you how to get to be the best combination of human being and human doing that you can be. And so these two things together have led about a third to a quarter of our boys to be in the boy crisis mode. They're almost always boys that are products of either divorce, where their fathers have not been more involved after the divorce, or children born to mothers who have not been married. And we know now that in 40% of cases where even the mother and father live together when the mother is pregnant, the father after 3 years is no longer involved with the child the great majority of time or at all. And
right.
These two segments of the population, the boys who are children of divorce without father involvement, and those boys who are children of mothers who have not been married, who have minimal or no father involvement. And those are the two segments of the population that are experiencing this enormous boy crisis and the suicides. And the suicides come from an extraordinary slippery slope that happens when you don't have fathers. When you don't have father involvement, there's usually much less likely to be postponed gratification. Without postponed gratification, the boy doesn't have the ability to focus on doing what he needs to do in order to get what he wants to have. So he gets distracted. Rather than finishing his homework, he gets distracted by texts or by video games, and he doesn't get his homework done. And then he starts feeling ashamed of himself that he's not as good as his male peers and female peers. When it comes to boy-girl time, girls don't go out with losers, so he doesn't find himself being attractive to girls. He starts he withdraws into video games or video porn. That makes him more and more depressed and addicted to either the games or the porn, which only reinforces his lack of success. And that leads to shame and further withdrawal and inability to feel like he's respected by his peers or by his teachers, not getting any awards in school. He may have talents in things like basketball or football, but he can't discipline himself to do the drills that are necessary to make himself one of the best, and so he sees himself failing in every area. And in worst-case scenarios, that leads to depression and suicide, and in the very worst-case scenarios, he becomes so angry at the people at school who don't see the sweet and lovely parts of him that he can potentially take to school shootings to sort of make himself visible for a short period of time.
Right. So it is a sort of a murderous reaction arising, and it's either turned in on himself or aimed directly outward. After looking at mental health crises and suicide, you look at it in crime. You say there's probably no better evidence of the increase of the boy crisis as a mental health problem than the fact that the U.S. jail and prison population increased by more than 700% between 1973 and 2013. Of that population, 93% are male and disproportionately young. We often allow that the disproportionate percentage of young black men in prison might reflect our racism, but rarely contemplate whether, since the other half of black men is men, that it may also reflect our sexism. And it is sexism, isn't it?
It really is sexism. I am very strong supporter of the Black Lives Matter movement, and people who don't understand that black people are more vulnerable to being picked up and sought out by a police officer and brought aside and questioned. Just really haven't lived among people who have had that experience. So Black Lives Matter, yes, but 24 out of 25 of the people that are shot by police officers are males and not females. And a high percentage of them are black males, but it's the percentage of black males that are shot and killed is only slightly more than the percentage of white males that are shot and or killed. But whereas the percentage of males that are killed versus females is a 24 to 1, and we see it's the black lives lost. That's visible to us, and the 24 to 1 ratio of males versus females' lives who are lost. I would bet that 99% of people don't even know that statistic.
It doesn't even dawn on people. And that problem is really just the start. You move on to physical health, and in physical health alone, males die significantly earlier in 14 of the 15 major causes of death. And that type of disaster is sort of repeated in every other major area of life, as we'll see. But health really is disturbing. I mean, disease of the heart, cancer, lung diseases, accidents, stroke, Alzheimer's, diabetes, influenza, suicide, blood poisoning, liver disease, Parkinson's disease, 14 out of 15. And it's not even a cultural issue.
Exactly, and certainly intentional self-harm, or suicide, and just things like we often hear now that women die as often from diseases of the heart without calculating the fact that yes, men die of diseases of the heart, but at a much younger age. And all of these 14 out of 15 areas of death are being much higher with men, and yet the important thing to understand in this context is that we have 7 federal offices of women's health and 0 federal offices of men's health. Can you imagine the sexism that we would be accurately accused of if women died 5 years earlier than men and died earlier of 14 out of 15 of the leading causes of death, and we had 7 offices of men's health and 0 offices of women's health? It's not conceivable that that would be the case.
Right.
Yet that is the case. And more potently, no one is protesting it, and very few people even know about it, even though this data is available by doing something as easy as looking up the Center for Disease Control and finding it.
Well, and that's part of the truly alarming nature of the crisis, is this absolute sort of thunderous cultural silence about this. You're just not even allowed to mention any way at all that males are disadvantaged or that boys are being treated unfairly. The same thing extends into what you call the death professions. You say every day 150 workers die from hazardous working conditions, and 92% of them are male. So these death professions include oil rig, lumberjack, welder, roofer, construction worker. In other words, basically the construction of the entire infrastructure of this country. And you say, in aggregate, these jobs might be thought of as glass cellar jobs, all male, because it's almost exclusively our sons who are willing to risk death so their family will have a better life. You don't see feminists fighting to get women into those jobs either.
No, we hear, and this is really one of, I think, the greatest injustices. You hear feminists talking about the fact that that men earn more money first for the same work, and we know from our previous discussions, yes, men do earn more money than women, or do they? Actually, it's not men that earn more money than women. It is dads who earn more money than moms. And is it for the same work? No, it's not for the same work. It is for 25 different characteristics of involvement in the workplace. So it is true that a woman with an art history degree may not make as much as a garbage collector who doesn't even have maybe a bachelor's degree, might even have dropped out of high school. But then you ask yourself, what do you need more of? Do you need your garbage collected more, or do you need more information about the piece of art you have on the wall more that you can get on Wikipedia? And the average person needs that garbage collected more than they need that information from art history. And so, yes, females who are art history majors are more likely to be women with college degrees who earn less than that male garbage collector. But all these things are not factored in. We have this broad belief that men earn more because they have more male privilege, not the types of jobs that men take to earn more money, even things that women can do very easily, like be an Uber driver or a Lyft driver. I think it's 7 out of 8 Lyft drivers and Uber drivers are males. This is something that anyone can apply to do. But I'm sure if you break down among taxi cab drivers, it's a similar ratio, about 10 to 1 actually, among taxi cab drivers that are males versus females. And in the inner city, the percentage of females that are taxi cab drivers get less. And then in the evening times, cab drivers have the highest rate of homicide of any profession, and they are much less likely to be males than females, even though the male rate of a cab driver being a victim of homicide is not greater than the female rate, and yet so we find that very few women in an area that takes no more muscle than males when it comes to inconvenient jobs, hazardous jobs, jobs in inner cities, working at night as a cab driver. The woman is much less likely to apply for these jobs. And so take a Lyft or an Uber, and the next time you do, or a cab, and ask the cab driver or the Uber driver how many hours a week he or she works. You'll usually find an answer between 60 and 70 hours a week. And if you ask them, do you do this because you have more male privilege? Or if it's a female driver, do you do this because you have a special amount of female privilege?
Right.
You'll just get laughed at. And
right.
and yet the belief that we have circulating in the culture is that men earn more money because they have more male privilege, without calculating the difference between these 25 different ways that men and women work, only one of which is the huge gap in hazardous jobs that men take versus women take.
Well, and when you actually compare men and women, you did a whole book on this. When you actually compare men and women, and you compare category to category, exact type of work, how many hours do you work, how much education does it take to get a job, et cetera, et cetera. When you actually compare apples to apples and oranges to orange and not apple to orange, as most of those do, then in every one of those categories, women make as much or more than men. I mean, there was a recent survey of 150 of the largest cities in America, and it found that in 147 of the 150 cities, women out-earned men for the same work by an average of 108%. Yes. And in some of the largest cities, it was 117%. But you never hear about that. And in a sense, that's exactly part of the boy crisis, is nobody knows about it.
Yes, exactly.
We still hear, President Obama saying women make 77 cents to $1. That's just categorically false.
Yes, it really is. And if you're listening to this and you're not familiar, all this data is in the Why Men Earn More book and what women can do about it. And it's really important because we really hurt women when we don't understand that women have the ability to earn as much or more for the same work, the same amount of hours. And I'll just give you one example of this. And so the data that you read says the types of things that, the 72 cents or 79 cents to the dollar. But women who have never been married and never had children, when compared to men who have never been married and never had children, both of whom have equal education and numbers of years worked, the women today out-earn the men by 117%. That's
right.
The average for never married women who have never had children.
Right.
And what is more surprising to people is that women who have never been married and never have had children have out-earned men who have never been married and never had children by since the 1970s. This is not a new statistic. And
right.
So they haven't out-earned men by as much as they have recently, but they have out-earned men significantly. So many people say to me, well, maybe this is because we don't value women enough, and so women earn less for those reasons, or that women just plain really work harder than people appreciate. So a good way to test that is by looking at women and men who own their own businesses, because if it's a boss that doesn't value you, then women who own their own businesses, who are the boss, would then clearly earn more than men who earn their own businesses if
right.
discrimination from above was the difference.
Right.
But when you compare women who own their own businesses, and you even control for women and men who both have MBAs, so you're not just taking educated men versus uneducated
right.
women or the other way around, then men who own their own businesses versus women who own their own businesses, the women earn 49% of what men who own their own businesses earn. And
yeah.
so one asks, my God, how could that be? Why is that? And when you survey women and men who own their own business and you ask them, what do you want out of owning your own business, 70-some-odd% of the men say, I want money. 26% of the women say, I want money. What the women say they want is to have more flexible time, to be their own boss, to have fulfillment, to have time with their family and friends, and spiritual time and athletic time for exercise and so on. And this is so it's a different set of values that leads the woman to getting exactly what she wants, which is a more balanced life with being able to be in charge of that life. And so versus what the man learns, which is that if I'm going to support my family and I'm going to be respected and successful, I should feel pressure to earn more. And so what the feminist movement hasn't gotten is that men earning more than women is part of discrimination against men. It is the society's pressure on men to be required to earn more in order to be eligible for marriage and especially to be a father and have children, and to be able to give women the options to be able to either work from home or work full-time or do some combination of both.
Right, and part of the whole problem of approaching this is the desire for a lot of people, well, I'll preface it by saying many people will look at a situation between two groups, and if they see any differences at all, any distinctions at all, they assume it's due to oppression.
Yes.
And so any other factors that might be playing a role in that, such as dad-deprived families or even simple things like number of hours that you put in. If you look at what male and female physicians earn, for example, male physicians tend to earn a bit more than female physicians. But males put in, just like you're talking about, by choice, they put in about 20% more hours than the average female physician does. And so, of course, that's going to show. But that's not counted. They really don't look at some of these background causative factors. And as you point out in this book, things like fatherlessness in a family isn't just correlated with a lot of the problems that we'll be talking about. It's directly causative. And that's one of the main things that you look for in social sciences, is the things that go together are correlated. They're not necessarily causative. This is causative. But if you're looking for just equal outcomes, if all you want is both groups to have exactly the same thing, flat out, then you're going to overlook any of these underlying causes. And then, of course, you're not going to really get at the problem, if there really is a problem, in why these differences are there. If you don't acknowledge the actual cause of those, you're never going to be able to cure them. It's like trying to cure AIDS without knowing about HIV. But that's so much of what we see, and it's truly part of a genuine problem here.
It really is. And if you're a woman listening to this, and it's really clear to me, and I'm sure to you, that, if you're heterosexual, part of what you want in life is men who are worthy of your love. And that you don't have to just be fixing men who are failures to launch. And so the boy crisis is really your crisis also. And if you're a parent, whether you're a mother or a father, you want your son to be productive, and you want him to be happy and not depressed and not withdrawn and not suicidal. And all these things are things that you have an interest in as well. There's no parent that I know of that says, I'm just hoping my son becomes a failure to launch. It's a real, it's a concern for all of us. And to say nothing about, national security. When I did the study, when I looked at the studies of ISIS recruits and found that 3 sociologists who did studies of ISIS recruits didn't even ask the question of whether the recruits what their relationship was with their father.
Right.
But it got volunteered by the recruits so often that they went back and constructed a question on that and re-asked the question with that, redid the interviews with that included.
Right.
And they found that almost every boy, and among the smaller percentage of girls that were ISIS recruits, almost all of them had in common, more than any other single thing, a lack of father involvement.
Right.
What I came to call in the Boy Crisis book, dad deprivation. And so, and it was not just, of course, ISIS recruits. It was also the, boys who did school shootings and boys who did mass shootings. Among the mass shootings, among the deadliest mass shootings, the 28 deadliest mass shootings since 1948, 26 out of those 28, the new Texas shooting being an exception, one of the two that are not the case, were lack of father involvement was a significant player and connected with the boys who did these, the deadliest of the shootings are defined as between 8 and 58 killed by the mass shooting.
Right. Jesus. That's alarming. Another area that gets alarming that you go over is the crisis of our sons' education. Worldwide, reading and writing skills are the two biggest predictors of success. These are also the two areas in which boys fall the most behind the girls. In the United States, by 8th grade, 41% of girls are at least proficient in writing, while only 20% of boys are. Worldwide, boys are 50% less likely than girls to meet basic proficiency in reading, math, and science. This is not good.
It is really disastrous because when you and I were younger, at least when I'm sure I'm older than you are, but when we were younger, if kids in our class did not if they weren't academically inclined, they knew that they could use their muscle, they could use their hands, they could be a mechanic and so on. And so they had a way of feeling good about knowing that they could be a construction worker and be fine with helping the family. And so therefore be respected and therefore be marriage material. But today, to an increasing extent, we have a morphing happening from the old muscle dependency to mental dependency, or from muscle to microchip, if you will. And so even people who are welders, for example, if you're a low-paid welder, you don't need a lot of education, but if you're going to be among the more select welders, you need background in physics and you need background in chemistry. And so boys who don't have this training in this education, this math, this science training. We know that boys could be good in math and science. We saw it in the generation that I grew up in. But suddenly with boys doing worse in math, science, reading, and writing, and the world being so dependent upon mental abilities for the future that even robots to be repairing those are going to require creativity and mental abilities. And so this is really scary. It's scary both for the boys and it's also scary for women who want to have options to be involved with the children. We haven't trained our daughters to be comfortable with men who are what I call father warriors, that are full-time fathers and overcome the barriers to be fathers, to be full-time involved with the children. This is a huge area that we need to focus on. If we're going to have boys that are less educated, we need to get those boys trained to be able to be good caretakers and women trained to be open to marrying men who may earn less but be very good at being sensitive, nurturing caretakers.
Right.
So all of these things are the enormous residuals of poor education, to say nothing of the national security of our country is very much dependent upon having a very high supply of well-trained people doing jobs that are high tech in orientation to be able to conduct all sorts of operations for our national security.
Right. Here's more of that educational scariness. In one generation, young men have gone from 61% of college degree recipients to 39%. Young women from 39% to 61%. In other words, in virtually all academic disciplines, women are graduating college at a 150% higher rate than men. 39%, I mean, just even in terms of the standard postmodern diversity argument, we're losing the diversity game here.
Absolutely. And you have something else that I talk about in the boy crisis as what I call the dropout, left-out cycle. And it's really, when you look at that, it's a very powerful sort of cycle. I identified 10 causes of the boy crisis, but everything came back to the most important cause being fatherlessness, and also the importance of marriages. I've never been a big person on the importance of marriage, and I always thought that, if men and women don't want to marry, that's fine, it's their choice. And
right.
It is their choice, except when you have children, because I have found out even when men and women live together, they have children. What I mentioned before was that 40% of those fathers are not involved with their children after the age of 3. And so here's the cycle that you have that results from that. In neighborhoods where marriage is scarce, you tend to have fathers being scarce. And in those neighborhoods, more than half of boys don't finish high school. So the boys drop out in essence.
Right.
And then the less education the man has, the more likely he is to be unemployed or underemployed. So he not only drops out of school, but he also has dropped out of the workplace. But then women who desire children think of an uneducated man as undesirable. And an unemployed man is just sort of like another child.
Right.
Hardly marriage material. So he's also left out of marriage and fathering.
Right.
So then the fourth part of the cycle is that some of the women with whom he nonetheless has sex become pregnant, and they raise children without him. Thus, we're back to step 1, the left-out dad that becomes the dropout son. That repeats that whole cycle. And that's the cycle we're caught in, that if we don't confront that, we are going to be repeating that in larger and larger percentages. And this is not just in the United States. This is all over in the developed world. In the 60 largest developed nations, boys do not do as well as girls in almost every academic area.
Right.
And so, what do developed nations have in common? They have in common 2 important things. Much more permission for divorce, and where there is divorced children, where there's divorced mothers and fathers, there's a much greater likelihood that the children will not have fathers, and then much greater permission also for women to have children without being married. In the United States, 53% of women who are under 30 who have children when they're under 30, 53% of them are not married, and that leads to that 40% statistic, more than the 40% statistic of the fathers not being involved with them, because that statistic includes not only the not being married statistic, includes not only men and women who live together, but also men and women who do not live together, where the statistic for fatherlessness is much, much higher.
Right, exactly, and we're going to be going over some of those numbers in just a minute. You mentioned that sort of shift from muscle to mental, and this is one of the reasons that it's so important to keep an integral overview in mind as we trace these things. As you know, an integral approach tends to say that there are at least 4 important dimensions that you want to look at with any situation. We call these 4 quadrants. And if you look at the right-hand quadrants, in the upper right you have the individual the individual being looked at in an exterior objective fashion. So if we look at a human being, then we're looking at various scientific studies about how that human being functions, its brain, its neurotransmitters. And when it comes to sexes, we do look at, see if we can find any differences between male and female sexes. But then in the lower right quadrant, it's the social, the collective looked at from an exterior objective fashion. And if we look at that lower right quadrant for a minute, one of the ways we can look at it is just in terms of the technoeconomic structure. And a researcher named Gerhard Linsky, looking over all of the various evolutionary unfoldings of technoeconomic structures throughout humankind's history, came up with a couple of just sort of fundamental categories of technoeconomic development that a society can have. And these are so sort of value neutral that many feminists even accept these categories and would use them to analyze gender roles at various periods in the past. And so it starts out, it goes from foraging, sort of a central part of it, goes from foraging or hunting and gathering to horticultural, to agrarian, to industrial, to informational. And foraging or hunting and gathering is pretty much what it sounds like. And often in terms of sexual roles, men did hunting, women did gathering. Wasn't very much conflict, and roles weren't well developed. We're talking about the earliest tribes themselves, 200, 300,000 years ago, not talking about indigenous people in today's world. But it gets really interesting when you move from foraging to horticultural. And horticultural is the first of 2 major technoeconomic modes of farming. The second one is agrarian. And the difference between horticulture and agrarian is in horticulture, farming is done with a simple digging stick or a hoe. And in agrarian, it's done with a very heavy animal-drawn plow. And one of my sort of favorite feminist systems theorists is Janet Chavez. And she's used Linsky's technoeconomic scheme to analyze gender roles at each of these major stages of development. And what we see happen here, and again, you still have to remember all four quadrants are going on, but what we see happening is that any sort of biological differences that we see in the upper right quadrant, Janet Chavez accepts two as being universal. And that is that, on average, men have greater upper body strength than women, and the second one is women give birth and lactate. And with those two simple biological universals, she can show how an enormous number of gender roles were differentiated when they interacted with these technoeconomic modes. So it's a little bit sort of a Marxist argument here, but we don't go wholeheartedly Marxist because we have four quadrants, not just one. But what you see happen as we move from foraging into horticultural is that a simple digging stick or hoe, Janet Chavez points out, can be handled quite easily by a pregnant woman. And during that historical period, women in quite large numbers were part of the public sphere because even when they were pregnant, they could use a digging stick or hoe. And indeed, Chavez estimates that around 80% of foodstuffs in horticultural societies are produced by women. Now, interestingly, in one of the ways that shows up, and it's not the only cause, but it's an important part, is that about a third of horticultural societies have female-only deities.
Yeah.
About a third have male and female, and about a third have male only. When we shift from horticultural up to agrarian, a very heavy animal-drawn plow, Chavez points out that women had extremely high rates of miscarriage. It was to their Darwinian advantage not to plow. And indeed they didn't. And as a matter of fact, so men all of a sudden are now alone and occupying the public sphere, and women, they weren't oppressed, according to Chavez. It was part of their choice. They chose not to suffer these miscarriages, and so they stayed more in the reproductive sphere. They were in charge of the household, any servants the family had, any slaves that they had, but the male was part of the public sphere. About 95% of those societies are what we would call patriarchal. And what that means that at least 95% of them had male-only deities. So wherever you find, the Great Mother Society became very famous when they were first discovered. In the West, Bachofen, for example, discovered what he referred to as the matriarchy underlying the patriarchy. And this is a big, big discovery. It was really kind of headline news in academic circles for quite some time. And feminists are always sort of pointing back to, we had the Great Mother, and then it was oppressed by the warrior patriarchal gods. But a large part what it was a shift in these techno-economic modes.
Yeah.
But wherever you find a Great Mother Society, a Great Goddess Society, it's horticultural. And so now we look at the really major shift that starts to swing into play in terms of the boy crisis, is the move from agrarian into industrial. Because what we're seeing in each of these techno-economic modes is that background techno-economic mode, the way we actually earn our survival, it acts as a selecting pressure on what of individual human characteristics will be selected at each of these eras. So what happens with agrarian, because it demanded much heavier physical work, the agrarian mode selected for the male upper right characteristics. It selected for a lot of muscle and not having miscarriages. And so, whereas in the horticultural, it was quite different. And so we see really different gender relations because of that. Now, when we move from agrarian, heavily patriarchal, male-only deities, men almost exclusively in the public sphere, women in the reproductive private sphere, when we move into industrial, all of a sudden machines start doing the work on nature that the previous mode demanded men do. So all of a sudden men are free. There's that selective pressure that selects men over women for that public sphere. That's gone. Because machines are now doing that work for us. And so all of a sudden, with the rise of the industrial era, you get, for example, all of a sudden men and women start to be looked at, and that also means different classes, different races, different ethnic groups, start to be looked at more in terms of equality. And we also had in the left-hand quadrants the emergence of a post-conventional moral development that moved from ethnocentric to world-centric. So even though in the previous horticultural and agrarian times, even though every major culture had one of the world's great religions had formed, and they were supposedly teaching love and compassion and care and all that, every one of those cultures had slavery. None of them got rid of it. Christian monasteries, Buddhist monasteries, they had slaves. Slavery was so widespread that the American Indians took their slaves with them on the Trail of Tears, for heaven's sakes. But all of a sudden, in the 100-year period, around 1770 to 1870, with the rise of the machine era, slavery is outlawed in every industrial country on the face of the planet. The first time that it ever happened. Now, this is also going to feed directly into the roles that men and women have. Mm-hmm. So you start to see written during the Enlightenment the first treatises on feminism, the first treatises on equality of men and women. And this, of course, just continues as we move into our particular era. So what happened is that, and you particularly emphasized this point, is that even though we had the emergence of this technoeconomic mode that would start to support much more equality and the liberation of those who appeared to be marginalized or split from the main culture, women tended to take advantage of that new freedom, and men didn't. And that's one of the main problems. So you frequently say, okay, the central cure for this is we have to have both men and women move into much more open roles. And instead of being stuck in our old roles that were fixed and given and unyielding and very, very limiting. And that's exactly right. Men are still, the roles that they were given in the agrarian society were protector and provider. Mm-hmm. That was it. Mm-hmm. And women, of course, were homemakers, period.
Yes.
All of that gets thrown up in the air. Women took advantage of it, men didn't. And we have a whole discussion about that, but you know as much about that particular movement as anybody. But that's part of the problems that we're dealing with. And so being able to have human beings actually open up the types of roles they can play and not simply and blindly accept roles, and worst of all, roles that were created by an out-of-date technoeconomic mode of development. That's a disaster. And so that's what we're looking at. And what's become really problematic is that the failure of boys and men to take advantage of that freedom and to, in a sense, be helped by the culture to move into new roles have left men with a purpose for it, and what boys with skyrocketing rates of suicide, drug addiction, homelessness, criminality. I mean, it's alarming. And we can see a large part of it stemming from that lack of meaning because we just haven't come up with new roles that men could play. Women, they're doing pretty good. And they have earned and fought and been given new types of roles they can play. As you say, they run a whole spectrum from homemaker on the one hand to devoted to office career on the other to anything in between. Men don't have that.
Yes.
And that's part of the disastrous problem that we're facing here.
There really is, and especially you see this when it comes to, men and women have a great deal of fluidity, or at least women have a great deal of fluidity. And this is, we have to give credit to the women's movement here, because they certainly pioneered women being multi-option women, being, raising children, raising money, or doing some combination of both. But, even as our sons, learn that if they are married and they have children, when the woman decides whether she wants to be a full-time raising children, full-time raising money, the man sits by and he has three different options also, which is, work full-time or work full-time or work full-time. Or
right.
If he's a working class man, it may be working two jobs, and if he's an executive type, he's more likely to be working overtime or taking jobs that are, instead of being in charge of some regional office, he's now taking on national responsibilities because he has to earn more money. So he experiences what I call the father's catch-22, which is learning to love his family by being away from the love of his family.
Right.
And so we have a real set of dilemmas here, which is that we haven't encouraged boys and men to think beyond their role of earning money, because we've cast earning money as privilege and power, and haven't understood that privilege and power is about the ability to control your own life, and it's about the ability to make choices. It is not about feeling pressured because you're male to earn money that often somebody else spends while you die sooner.
Right.
No one has brought this into the culture. When I mentioned before about that men earning more money when they're fathers and than mothers do when they're mothers is not discrimination in favor of men. It is discrimination against men. It is the discrimination, it is the pressure that men experience that when they are fathers to solidify their one role, as opposed to a negotiation between any given man and woman to feel like, do you want to play more of one role than the other, or to what degree do we play equal roles, and then divvying up those equal roles? Or do you want to take care of the children primarily for a few years, and then I'll take care of them for a few years, and we'll rotate back and forth? And yes, we'll probably earn less money totally that way, but is it worthwhile for us to do that in order to be able to care for our children better? The discussions we need to be having in schools is discussions that question the propensity of males to only be valued if they're earning money. And we have the messages about this pressure on males to only be valued if they're earning money all around us. I think most of us have heard the ad for K Jewelers, that every kiss begins with K. And if you think about that, the translation is, a diamond for a kiss. Or conversely, or not conversely, but the other way of looking at this is every kiss begins with pay.
Right.
And so, and this sounds like just humor, but when we do surveys of women versus men, 72% of women say that the man should pay the full bill.
Right.
And it's not like this is discrimination by women toward men only. 82% of men agree that men should be responsible for paying the full bill on the first date.
Right.
And so we are still in a culture where we're saying to boys and men, you are not worthy of a woman's romantic attention until you compensate for your inferiority by being the one who is more likely to have to pay for the bill on the first date.
Right.
And so most women will not even consider going out with a man who isn't oriented toward doing this once they graduate from college. And 3 out of 4 women say they wouldn't even date an unemployed man.
Right.
Whereas the reverse, dating an unemployed woman is fine for 2/3 of men. So we have this enormous pressure on men to earn more, even though they happen to be doing less in education. And no one is saying we're not saying to our sons at home or to our young men in grammar school and high school, someday you may be as likely to be a father more often when the children are young than the mother will be while the mother goes out and works. So we need to train you as parents. You have a new sister that's been born, so we're going to teach you how to feed the sister. We're going to teach you how to train your infant sister's diapers or your brother's diapers. we're going to prepare you to be a babysitter for your sister. And when people in the neighborhood ask you, do you have a babysitter available, to get our parents to be likely to say, Jimmy, I have Jimmy at home. He's not going out that evening. He can be the babysitter as much as Sally can be the babysitter. And so there's hundreds of ways that we give boys the message that being a father warrior, if you will, is not a way of being respected by men, and we don't train our sons to do that. We don't train our sons to focus on their value being more in developing emotional intelligence by learning how to communicate and learning how to hear personal criticism without becoming defensive, and learning how to listen to women by not solving their problems but by just listening to women and facilitating them to solve their own problems. And we're still training our sons to be the ones to risk sexual rejection, even though girls are, as a rule, in school, they're more mature than boys are. They know more about boys than boys know about girls. They're the ones that are less likely to want sex a great deal. And so, from all the logical perspectives, it would be really helpful to both our daughters and our sons if the sex that wanted sex less was trained to risk rejection with the people that they want sex with and ask and initiate connection with them. But
Right.
We're still saying to our daughters, you do have the option to be the one who initiates an interest with a boy. But boy, you don't have the option. You have the expectation to do it. And once, of course, you've asked a girl out, it would be, of course, appropriate for you to pay. So he not only has to take the risk of rejection, but he has to take, then he has to pay for it on top of that. So he's in double jeopardy mode. And then when the boy risks rejection in an inappropriate way, we hashtag him Me Too and say that he was inappropriate in one way or the other. And if he's fearful of taking those initiatives, he doesn't reach out to the girl he's most interested in, and therefore that girl never knows, and so that boy often ends up without girls. So he's either a loser because the girl that he's interested in doesn't know, or he oversteps his bounds and is considered a part of the problem. And we saw this with the boy in Texas. He had reached out to a girl that was not interested in him, and then he became more assertive about that, and then the girl stood up in class and embarrassed him in front of the entire class, saying that he had overstepped his bounds, and a week later he killed her and another of his peers.
Right. I know. It reminds me, every time I sort of listen to these types of topics and what some of the causes are and what some of the possible solutions are, always reminded how, again, human beings, not only do they have all these quadrants and all these different states and all these different lines, but they certainly have various stages of development, various levels of development, and, half of them are pretty rational. And so if I look, for example, at the work that you've done, I've found virtually every major point you've ever made to be unbelievably rational and backed with evidence, and I've agreed with probably 99% of it. And yet we look around at the culture around us, and you don't find hardly any of it. I mean, that's why I say you're a true countercultural writer in that sense. You're always talking about truths that our culture just doesn't seem to recognize. So in other words, our culture is not being very rational because these things are so straightforward if you actually get all of the data. They certainly make much more sense than they do now. You do look into some of the reasons, as one chapter puts it, why we're so blind to the boy crisis. This is a couple paragraphs, but I'm going to read it. When a police officer shoots a black boy, we protest. Black Lives Matter. Good. These protests catalyze an important examination of our underlying biases. But the other half of black boy is boy. The police are 24 times more likely to shoot a male than a female. The boy is shot both because he's black and because he's a boy. So why are we blind to the boy in black boy? Because for much of our history, blindness to boys' deaths is the way we as a society have survived. When our very survival is dependent on our sons' willingness to die, sensitivity to the death and suffering of boys and men is in competition with our survival instinct. To win wars, we had to train our sons to be disposable. We honored boys if they died so we could live. We called them heroes. And old roles die pretty hard, don't they?
They really do, and we think that roles. We have so much emphasis in society on, gender transition and gender fluidity and being transgender, and Hillary Clinton put a huge amount of emphasis on that. Even as the great majority of the population is still, their son is still expecting that if they're warm and tender and sensitive and nurturing, we don't introduce them into their value of being seen to be valued in this area. We sort of still have them very, very much slated in a relatively stiff role, and this has become greater and greater for young men in high school today. I talk in the beginning of the Boy Crisis book about a fellow named Royce Mann. This is a real life person that's his actual name. He was 14 years old when he did this wonderful, terrible video for Hatch that went viral very quickly. And Hatch is an outlet for creativity. And this boy stood up, Royce Mann, and he said, I knew what it was to become a man when I was on the street one day at age 14, and the woman in front of me looked behind, got a glimpse that it was a male, me, and crossed the street. I knew then that I wanted to remain like Peter Pan, always a boy, because I knew when I became a man what I would be, that I would be feared, that my hands would be treacherous, that I would be an attacker, that I would be a father, that I would be a husband, but I would be an attacker, mostly an attacker. And then he underlined mostly an attacker, underlined an emphasis. And I thought to myself, here's a 14-year-old boy who's perceiving of his future with such enormous shame that he wants to always remain a boy, because to become a man is to become mostly an attacker. And so, yes, this boy will not grow up to be a sexual harasser, most likely, because he's so super sensitive, but he's going to be filled with shame, and already is. And so boys are then entering into college today, and they're learning that they are males, and so therefore they have male privilege. And so when we talk about male-female relationships, and the boy feels like, why am I the one expected to buy the drinks? Why am I the one expected to pick her up? Why am I the one expected to pay? And why am I the one expected to risk sexual rejection? If he says any of that, he will be told he's mansplaining, and he'll be told that he is somebody who is just part of the dominant culture, and he should just, therefore, that it's his turn to shut up and women's turn to speak up. And then he's told he's in an institution of higher education and higher learning, where everyone is supposed to be in an institution of higher education and learning, able to think and talk about everything together. And he's being told to be careful, don't say this because it's politically incorrect. There are trigger warnings, and there is so much restriction on his speaking. And so the old male role, which is don't get in touch with your feelings and don't share what's bothering you, is now being reinforced, not liberated, for boys and men. And what boys and men say in end of high school and college is no longer being even seen as being valued, but seen as being part of the oppressor class speaking. So we've taken the old male role and put straitjackets around it to make sure it stays that way, even as we blame boys for having the old male role and call that old male role toxic masculinity. And boys are not able to articulate any of this, and they know that to articulate any of this, to even think about any of this, might tempt them to articulate it. And if they did articulate it, they would just be looked at as being Neanderthal or something wrong with them, and shut up and listen. And this is a terrible time for a boy to try to be both sensitive to women, that's okay, but also sensitive to his own expectations and pressures on him, and to be able to speak up about this. Instead, boys feel ashamed that they're having all these feelings. They're wanting to be sexual with the beautiful girls in school who don't have an interest in them, but they're told sex is dirty, and then that women are not that interested in it as sooner as often as they are, and so they're withdrawing. They withdraw into things like porn that limits their dopamine to being stimulated by greater and greater amount of risks with girls, and then they get together with a real-life girl, and they feel that that real-life girl is not interested in being just an object in a porn movie with them, so the girl rejects them, understandably so, and he then goes back into depression and gets involved with more porn because it hurts less to be rejected by an object than it does to be rejected by a full human being. And so he turns to porn because porn is basically access to a variety of attractive women without fear of rejection at a price he can afford. And so these are things that are just creating so many dilemmas, but no one is, I hope that in the boy crisis I try to articulate these dilemmas so that teachers and parents can have family dinner nights and in constructive ways where they create safe environments for all of their children, and they as parents to be able to speak with each other about these issues that are now beginning to be not okay to be spoken about in school. And so that was really one of my great inspirations for writing The Boy Crisis.
We hope you enjoyed this excerpt from Warren Farrell and Ken Wilber's recent discussion, The Boy Crisis. If you'd like to hear the rest of this fascinating 3-hour conversation, we invite you to become a supporting member of integrallife.com.